Hello, Lauren. Hello, everyone. Great to be here. Great to have the exhibit there with you at Vesterheim. And it's a lot of fun to be able to get to explain some things in each one of these images that are years of work from my little studio.
Well, and I know there's so many details in all of these, so we're pleased that you can join us to tell us a little bit more, maybe some about some of the elements we should be watching for in the paintings, or maybe something about the models or other details. So why don't I get our slides up so that you can share a couple things about the paintings? And I know that we wanted to pick one favorite one first, which is the stone cutter. We've been using this to publicize the exhibition. So this would be a great one to start with.
Well, obviously, yeah, this is the very first painting in the series. This kind of launched the whole idea. Of course, all 21 images I didn't work on at one time. So this was the beginning piece. And this was actually the photo shoot that we did for this was done after much research here in Wyoming. And the gentleman who is the stone cutter is actually an artist himself in real life. So not only did I have to go into doing the research on this for weeks and months at a time, in my mind, I already knew the whole scenario of where he was going to be carving this stone on the island of Gotland and the location, which we found. And then the whole scenario of with his trusty companion there alongside him early in the morning, and a ship leaving at the time. And if you look in the background, you'll see the horse in the distance. His horse is kind of watching the ship going out to the ocean, and he's thinking, "Gosh, I wish I was going on that trip." Uh, so what I did to begin with, for example, not only did I do the photo shoot with this gentleman, but the size of that particular stone is documented, and that stone is in the National Museum in Stockholm. So what I did was I took the exact measurements of the stone, cut out a piece of plywood in that exact shape to have the proportion correct, had him there and go through this whole carving scenario. So we had everything completely in proportion of how big the stone was when the carver was working on it and so on, in order to make sure that everything was correct. And of course, being early morning, he has a little fire there because he got started right at dawn. And he has food and mead there with him for the day. So, once this image was put together, then I knew how the rest of it was going to unfold. But this was really the beginning image, and uh, I will randomly talk about the frames on each piece too as we go through everything. But this is the only frame I did not build in the show. I did restore it. I found this in an antique store. It's over 100 years old, and it was in pristine condition. So I went ahead and restored it and did all the copper leaf on it. Once the original was finished. So this kind of launched the whole theme and whole series, and so this is a very special piece. And I hope many of you get to see it in person. This particular piece, of course, is the second in the book. The sailmakers were a very important part of what you could call industry at the time, basically. So if a chieftain commissions a shipbuilder to build his ships, the shipbuilder, of course, is doing the shipbuilding, and then you'd have a whole team of ladies that started with the shearing of the sheep, the spinning of the wool, working on the loom. These sails were tremendous in the amount of time that they took to create. So it had to be a pretty big team effort, and it had to be done in an area where something this large could be moved back and forth. And of course, like many other things involved that you'll see in items in the painting, they didn't just stop with creating a sail. Of course, they like to embellish it with what we could call now a logo, or something that personifies the chieftain people leaving on this commerce uh, a trip. It wasn't all, but it wasn't. They weren't spending this much time building the ships and sails to go out and raid or anything like that. They were going out to trade, barter, uh, and create commerce. So this was a really integral part of the whole series. And if you look on the corners, you'll see I sculpted small pieces of linen. I used a clay and made impression in the clay with the linen. And again, each one of these frames were all you know very separately worked on and hand done, and that part I could go on about for hours, but that's for another time. And here we have the shipbuilder. Of course, this has been uh, the integral and probably the most popular image in the book, along with everything else, simply because when people think of Norse culture, of course, one of the first things they think about are the amazing ships. And here we have a chieftain, the Jarl. He was the money guy who would come to a craftsman, and much like today, if you're going to build a house, you go to a general contractor and you commission them to build your home. Well, that's how it was then. Of course, they didn't just haphazardly build these amazing ships and then go out and get into trouble and everything that you hear all these stories about. That craftsman is explaining to the chieftain how his ships move across the water. And they were an engineering feat. You can see that also in the bow of the ship, you see all of the carvings. So once again, they didn't stop with just the ship itself. They really went into doing the carving and making it something very special. And they were very proud of their work. And that has perpetuated into the work you see today of wood carvers and shipbuilders in this region. So, of course, we have not only all of the tools and the items that you see in the painting being used, everything is researched. You'll see tools there that these were being used 1,000 years ago, and they're still being used today in modern shipbuilding. If they're doing the lapstrake construction, is what these type of ships were called. So you see the whole family affair there. The little girl with her bear, and I've talked about that in many of my presentations that in old Norway, many folks had house bears. Of course, they were pets. And, it's an interesting thing that you don't think about today, especially with me living near Yellowstone National Park. You have grizzly bears nearby, and at first, when you see them, they're a fascinating creature, but when you see how much havoc they can just wreak havoc, and so it's interesting that these were their pets. And in the background, you'll see the chieftain's wife bringing, or the shipbuilder's wife bringing food to the chieftain, and his brother, the uncle, hooking up the logs in the background to bring around to split to make the keel, and his wife holding the little Norwegian fjord horses that they weren't very big in stature, but very strong, very powerful, very agile. And this particular location is an actual location near Andalsnes, Norway. It's Romsdalfjorden, and this is evidence in that whole area of ancient shipbuilding sites there. So uh, again, in my book, the whole story behind this painting goes into even more detail. But to round it out, I decided to sculpt little pieces in the corners of the bow of the ship coming toward you out of the surf to kind of give it the three-dimensional quality that it has. So this is one of the many fun ones to create.
You mentioned that you often use archaeological evidence for specific elements in the paintings. When has evidence not been available and you've had to use some of your own artistic license?
Well, fortunately, there's a lot of information out there that the academians, the archaeologists have already found. Uh, and, the academic papers that I use to do my research with for everything are very dry. They're very hard to read. So the general public usually doesn't either take the time or they're not quite interested. Now, if it's a fictional story or something that's woven and is much more colorful, people love to read that. But I had to trudge through the salt mines to get through that information and put everything together, basically, proverbially speaking. And a lot of the information is out there. Of course, recently there's a glacier in Norway that has been melting, and many artifacts have been found completely intact in amazing condition from 1,000 to 3,000 years old. And there's so many more things that have been discovered that before were just a theory. And now they're finding these things. So I've have pretty much every piece of information in the book, and behind every painting is something that's already been found that I uncovered. So yeah,
Thank you.
it's been an interesting journey that way.
Are you ready for the next painting?
I am. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, that's
Yes,
fine. Great. Here
please.
we
Yeah.
go.
The Navigator. This is Faroe Islands, and still today you will see those birds, the puffins that live in that area and nest up in the cliffs. And this is Strimoy is the area that it's in. And here you see a gentleman who is a navigator and also a shipbuilder out with his wife, and they are practicing with a piece of Icelandic spar, which was used on cloudy days uh, to bring the sun out with their compass and illuminate it in such a way that they could find their bearings. Much like when some of us were small children, if you had a magnifying glass, you would go outside and have a little piece of paper there and see if you could burn a hole or an image into the paper from the magnifying glass, pulling all the light in. So yeah, the marine life in the area, they're quite curious about what's going on because it's just like a spotlight in the water to them. And the ship that they're in is a small craft that um, this gentleman built, but he's not only the navigator, he's also the main captain on some of the larger expeditions. And it's just an interesting moment because this young couple is there together and they're testing out this stone. In this particular frame, I took some seashells that come from that part of the world, Atlantic seashells, and made the impressions to do the sculptures in the corner. And then, of course, we have green metal leaf and gold and copper leaf on the edges of this frame. But it's just a fascinating area, and it's a fascinating time of day, and it's small points in history that people don't really think about that just tie in with daily life. Every day wasn't monumental, much like our days today. We have big days and we have sleepy days. So this was just an interesting time for them, and it was part of their not primitive but early navigational equipment that they used. And oftentimes, it wasn't just the equipment. Many of these mariners would just watch the movement of the marine life. And if they thought they were getting somewhere close to land, they would take a dip in the water and see what it tasted like. And if it wasn't all salt water and they knew it was mixed with some fresh water, they were getting close to land because that's where the river systems were entering into the ocean. So it was a very simple way of getting around, but they sure did it. Now the next painting, of course, is the burly fellow and his smithy, as they call it. And this particular blacksmith, you could usually tell how good he was, how busy he was, how well off he was by the anvil being used to create all of the products that he's creating. Because iron was something that wasn't easy to come by during those times, and most anvils were very small, about the size of what a jeweler would use today. So this gentleman is in a colony Hedeby, which is now part of modern day Germany. Um, and he's in a shop that most blacksmiths didn't even have a roof over their heads at that time. They worked outside, so this gentleman was very, very sought after. And some of the things that he's creating in the background, some folks probably would be shocked to hear about. But if you look below the helmet to the right, you see a flat piece of metal there, and that's actually a locking mechanism, very complicated locking mechanism that they would create. And then, of course, they would work with the jeweler in the colony, and the jeweler would create the key for it. And you'll see that in the painting of the jeweler that's in my book that touches on that. So you do see some swords there and the helmet, but again, that's not what this man was creating. 90% of what he created were farm tools. You see the chain behind him. You see the building tools. Uh, he has a bellows there that's a double bellows, which means he really had to produce. So um, luckily he had his little critter friends with him. That's a Norwegian forest cat in the window, and the forest cats came along on the ships as mousers when the Norse would travel. Of course, they would bring grain and all of that. So these cats were known to be spread to different areas of the world by way of being along on the ships as mousers. So he's found a really good spot up there in the window, some mousing. And this would have been a very typical blacksmith's shop, who, like I said, was doing very, very well. Um, Now on the frame, I decided to use iron. I have some hand forged iron on the corners done by a local blacksmith. Then I forged all of the rest of the iron and that you see around the edges. We have some Thor's hammer, which was called Mjolnir, and that is kind of shaped into the corners and by way of this molding that I was using. So we have every uh, inch of the painting itself and the frame itself was all fashioned together to kind of give you that feel of what this man would have been creating and have surrounding him. And of course, this also is another piece, a very popular piece from the book that people have ordered prints of because it's just, again, a very classic scenario. And the gentleman who modeled for it, uh, that's exactly what he looks like. There's nothing embellished. That's how big he is. No steroids. He's not taking any steroids. This guy was the real deal. And I've been fortunate to find these folks to model in each painting that you see. These are all real people who modeled for me in period clothing.
Are a lot of these models living in Wyoming where you find them?
They are actually, they are. And I've spoken about this in a lot of my presentations, but most of the folks that I discover, I'll meet at the deli in the grocery store. And of course, I'll just say, I think you would really be great in one of my paintings. Here's my card. Would you model for me? And the reaction is always mixed. Some people say, gosh, that would be fun. And some folks simply don't respond and walk away. So, it's back in the salt mines for trying to create this whole book. And, there's some adventures along with that, just finding the right people to model for this because uh, it was important to me to pick a specific persona to convey the image of the individual in each painting. And, much like Norman Rockwell, the early illustrator, people don't realize that those were all real folks that modeled for him. And it's extraordinary, their expressions and their movement. And for him to capture that, he knew that was the only way to be able to convey the true story of what was really happening. So as you see each image, from my book that's in the exhibit, you'll be able to feel some personality coming from these folks. Okay, and this next piece, this one in particular, also has some interesting individuals in it who modeled for me, also local. The lady who is playing the Uhika Is what's that instrument is called today, still in modern Finland. It's called the uhika, a string instrument. You could play it as a violin or a fiddle with a bow, like she's doing. It could be played sort of like a lute or a guitar as well. Uh, and the tuning keys that are on top of this are actual keys that have been found in an archaeological dig. Uh, and then, of course, the archaeologists figured out what type of instrument they belong to, and that's what this is. But the lady that is very happily playing this instrument uh, is a local person that I found. And she was born in Sweden and grew up in the U.S., raised by Norwegian parents. And interestingly enough, she joined the Marine Corps at the age of 18, did two combat tours in the Middle East at two different times as a combat Marine, and moved back to Wyoming. And her and her husband are working law enforcement for the Forest Service. Um, but she was an extraordinary model. She's also in the Village Builder painting. And then, of course, the rest of the cast and crew there in the background, this would have been a family affair with uncle and both uncles and aunt playing harp in the background. But the forest in Finland is so dense that oftentimes, you'll have animals that will be watching or listening and you won't see them. So if you look into the background in one area behind her shoulder up to the left is a flying tree squirrel that's indigenous to Finland. And then the lady playing the harp to the right of her, you'll see a roe deer, and the roe deer are very small. They're about the size of a very small African antelope. And then above the flute player, you'll see the little bear dog there that's hanging out with them. But so the animals have showed up to listen to this music and listen to what's going on. So um, the acoustics in a spot like that probably would have really been amazing. And of course, I recreated the instrument in clay on the corners of the frame, the uhika. And then in the center of the painting, you'll see another type of string instrument along with the drum. And interestingly enough, these drums that they still play this music with today uh, were made of the same materials that the natives and the indigenous people here in the United States, when they made drums, they had the same type of material: the wood, the leather, the sinew. And so, it's kind of an interesting thing that in how musical instruments can span across continents. Um, so that it's interesting how that all ties in with that. But yeah, so this was a happy piece to put together.
We can see the frame well on this particular image. This might be a good time for me to stop sharing the slides so that you can tell us a little bit more of the construction of the frames.
Oh, that would be great. I'd love to. I'd love to. So one thing that I have here is a corner sample of the frame molding that I had custom made. Now, usually this poplar would come out in a block, and to get the shape of this particular profile, you have to have special knives made. And the craftsman has a who mills these. His tool is called a shaping machine, and they're very large. So I designed this specific profile with the shape, so that it could be stained easily, hold the color in this region. This part of the liner could take the gold leaf or the copper leaf very easily. And this flat edge, you could apply different shapes of trim and chair railing to, so that even though when we started out with a block of wood that had this shape, by the time we were done and did all the finishing, it didn't look like this anymore. This one, of course, had rounded corners. And this particular corner sample, I don't know if you can see the divots in it, but I used this one to shape the copper hammers for the blacksmith's frame. So there are all these behind the scenes little tools and little things that you have to make in order to create the frame itself. So I knew from the very beginning, in order to bring the whole theme of every painting out, that this is where we had to start. So I designed these and had these all made, and that's so when you look at each frame in the show in the exhibit, um, you'll see a similarity, but they're all very different in their color and shape and everything. So um, the stages that are involved in building a frame like that, you would think is very simple, but you have to be working at three or four of them at a time. And as you're building them, I would have the originals there, and I would bring them in and compare them to the type of stain in the corners that I had, and so there were quite a few hours, even into very small parts of each frame, to make sure that it fit with the theme and the color and the feeling of the painting. So it was very very well thought out, and perhaps I went overboard with it at times to make sure that everything was as perfect as possible. But um, that's the thing, is that you will see many beautiful pieces of furniture that are crafted today, or sculptures, or whatever else, and especially with the folk art school there at Vesterheim, you got some amazing craftspeople that come in and do some amazing their craft, and the folks working on them. And of course, in your main collection, you have some of the most extraordinary types of carving and everything that you see. But what most people don't realize is how much time the craftspeople have behind it, and not just hours. Sometimes it's weeks, sometimes it's months, sometimes certain items, if they're waiting for an additional piece of material that they can't get at the beginning, they may wait a year until they find the right thing that will go together to make their carving or build whatever they're building, the chairs, the extraordinary work that you see, the Scandinavian built items you see at Vesterheim and the main collection, are just uh, through the roof. It's amazing. It's hard to believe, looking at some of those, that a human being crafted them by hand. Um, so that's the thing. And so I knew very well that with these frames in each image, we really had to make sure that it was the best that I could possibly create, as well as the table, the red oak table that's in the exhibition too.
And we'll give
And that
folks a
that was
glimpse at that a little later in the presentation.
right, right. Yeah. So I think we might be at a point. If anyone has a question or two, I would love to answer some questions. Otherwise, I can go back into some of the images and talk about those.
Sure. And a reminder, just if you've got questions for Sven, you can put them into the Q&A. Hopefully on your computer, the button is down at the bottom, and we'll be checking that periodically to see if you've got questions. And no questions so far, so we could go back to the slides again. Let me get those up for folks. And there's another look at one of the frames. Now that we've gotten the behind the scenes look at the frame and the construction, here's a good glimpse of that on the finished artwork.
Yes. And I wish I could tell you that I'm creating these exactly the way they were done 1,000 years ago, but I can't say that. I did use some modern materials and some of the varnishes and that type of thing, uh, to complete everything. So I can't claim to be doing all of this framework in the old style. So I did use some modern day tools in order to create some of this, especially the clay and all of that. All right, here we have the wood carver. Many interesting things about this piece. One in particular, not only is the work he is doing, the type of motif that he's doing, but this gentleman's a young fellow, local fellow. His four generations of his family are in my book in different paintings, and I can point some of those out at one point. But this gentleman is a wood carver in real life. He is Scandinavian ancestry, obviously, and he did have a pet fox that's in the painting there. I met the fox, actually. He was an interesting animal. Uh, But if you take a really close look by having the book, or when you're looking at the exhibit, you'll see the little mouse below the fox, because he's bringing home some food for the wood carver. Uh, Now, I doubt very seriously this fellow ate the mouse, but the fox was really happy about it, so that was, part of his diet. But here, this craftsman's working out in the woods in Sweden, and you see the one of the main things that the carvers are known for is the masthead that you see behind him there to the right of the ship's masthead. But not only would he have been carving ornamental things for a ship, he also would have been doing the functional things like shaping handles for farm tools, like you see the axe to the left of him there. He also would make the handles and fashion the handles out of various hardwoods. And this particular carving he's working on, this carving style was defined as Barola, and it's in a very early time period, right around 500 AD is when this style of carving originated. And if you have one of my books and you look through the pages of the book, every border around the text has this ornamental style of carving in it. The border around the text in the book, the borders on the vignette pages in between. And then in the corner of this frame, once you are up close and you can take a look, that particular carving style is also impressioned in those corners that I placed in and sculpted. It's also the Barola style. Um, and the chisels that you see him using, both in his hand and to the right, those are still chisels being used today by carvers. And any carver will know that by looking at this, they'll know right away. Uh, but once again, this all ties back to, for example, the Osberg ship, which is the Queen's ship in the museum Oslo. And if you take a look at my book cover, you'll see the carving style, which comes from the Osberg ship, and that dates back to around 930 AD. And this is in oak. This is in white oak, like my table. And this carver was extraordinary. But one of the things that is part of the whole story that goes along with the painting, the wood carver, is not only was the carver himself very talented, but the blacksmith that created the chisels had to be very, very advanced in his metal working, because in order to carve a hardwood like that, uh, any carver will tell you he has to have good steel to keep an edge so that he can keep working. But if it becomes dull very quickly, he's toast for the most part. So in this painting, the wood carver with his chisels, looking at that, it brings back the thought of his probably very good friend, the blacksmith, that made some amazing chisels for him. And that's how everything ties together in Norse society. It was all about, a community and family and camaraderie, and everyone worked together, because they knew that was part of the survival. I mean, of course, in the midst of these times that were difficult times, they found time and found a way to create beautiful things. And of course, that still lives on today at the folk art school. um, so again, it's interesting that when you think of a wood carver during this time period, you wouldn't think he would be very advanced. You wouldn't think he would be very skilled, but in actuality, they were incredibly skilled. And with what people thought were primitive tools, really weren't that primitive. They were very highly advanced with what they were working with.
I
Um,
know that not of all of our guests
and
today have seen the exhibit in person. What's the approximate size of some of these finished paintings?
most of these paintings are around, the image alone is 33 by 44 roughly, so they're over 3 feet by 4 feet on the outside of the image. So they're quite large, and once I built the frames for them, then they definitely will fill a space in the wall. And once again, it's very difficult to paint the right image with depth and the right color very, very small. So a lot of my work is relatively large. In fact, I'm even working on some paintings right now that are 4 foot by 6 foot in their imagery, and there's a lot of time involved in that. But that's how you can get all the detail in, and when you're able to get the detail in, that's how you can really tell the full story of what was happening. You know, again. In painting history through the years, it's always been important to me to make sure it's factual history, and that in order to do that, you have to show great detail so that when you look at one of my historical paintings, I've taken the time to do all the research and to find these items and go through everything it takes to create the right scenario so that when you look at it, you don't have to wonder if he had those type of tools, or if he wore a tunic like that, or if he would have been in a place like that. It's all heavily researched. And so that's important when you're creating you know images for a storyline, because it's very important. I mean, as artists, we have a responsibility to create things that you can take one look at and feel good about when you see them and want to be part of it.
If we don't count the time doing the research and if we don't count the time spent making the frames, do you have any way to estimate the amount of time you spent just on the painting itself, using this one maybe as an example?
Absolutely. Oh gosh, again, it does depend a little bit on the size of the painting, but for the most part, this piece was probably 2 months. Now I work in rotation. I'm usually working on several pieces at one time. Uh, but the painting end of it becomes technical at a certain point. So probably the most time consuming part of doing a painting is uh, coming up with the theme, doing the research, finding the right people. I've had to wait sometimes months until I could do photo shoots with the right person, and then all the other added elements, putting all that together. So I spend a lot of time on all the preliminary before I ever even get to the paint part of it. But even with that, this was, for example, around 2 months. This particular piece.
Oh, that's
The
fascinating.
shipbuilder painting, which we looked at earlier, that was 6 months on that one painting alone. So not involved. So what do we have? Oh, here we have the bowyer, the bow maker. And first of all, this is in Norway. This is the bowyer, and people aren't thinking about that. Again, they just think about Norse culture having swords involved and everything else. But this was a gentleman that crafted bows and arrows for people to bring food home. And once again, if you look at the top of the bow, it's hand carved. So he didn't just stop with creating the bow. There was much carving going on in it as well. His wife, she's the bow and arrow tester. She's making sure that everything is straight and true, and obviously she would become very, very skilled at that craft, and as a archer she would become very skilled, because this is what they did every day, all day long, besides gathering their food uh, as well. But on the right side of this particular frame, I built an arrow, a replica arrow, using raven feathers at the top. uh, this was an arrow that was discovered in a dig in Denmark. Nydam is the dig. And if you look at the arrowhead I had made for me by a local blacksmith, it's hand forged. But what you can't really tell from the side is that if you look at the arrow from the front, it was triangular. Okay, now that was crafted that way for a specific reason, because when it comes to bringing food home, you have to have the right type of tools to do that as well. Otherwise, folks are going to starve to death. So probably the bowyer and the time that they spent using their materials and their product came up with this design because what rather than having to shoot an arrow 6 times, you could usually shoot it once, and you would bring home the food. So I had this specifically made, and this design is from an archaeological dig, like I said, in Denmark. So it was fun to get to have this along with the scenario, and again, it's everything authentic, made by hand, um, and of course, though he's got his little friend hanging out with him there, falling asleep on his lap while he's making the doing the last parts of his bow and the quivers there. And this particular arrow is the type that you would see in that quiver. And it's a wooden quiver too. It's not a leather quiver. You would think oftentimes with archers you'll see leather, but wood was something that they had a lot of at that time with the forests nearby. It was something that they could build almost anything with, as well as his chair. That's an old Scandinavian style chair. I think there is one in the permanent collection of the museum with Vesterheim there that's a similar chair like this that you'll see, although it's more embellished. This is one that would have been outside in the elements. And then, of course, their dwelling back there, the little longhouse, is their home, and this is a specific spot in Norway. Uh, so even today you'll find stones in the ground that have these little indentations in them. And much like the one in front of him where the bows are laying on, they would use those to straighten the arrow shafts like a big piece of sandpaper. So once they would cut the length of the arrow in sometimes 6 foot length, depending on how long the tree limb was, then they could use that as just a big sander and sand out the arrow shafts and turn them over and sand them again. Uh, and it was, of course, a primitive way to do it, but it was a brilliant way to do it, and it worked very, very well. And what's interesting is today you can still go to different parts of Scandinavia and find these stones. It's remarkable. What they turned out some incredible products just with something simple like that, and that's a high degree of intellect. Here she is, the Skald. Once again, something that people don't think about in Norse culture, but during Alting, which was the yearly gathering in particular, which was also market, um, one of the great things was you had some performers. And in Norse society, the Skald, who was a poet, was very, very sought after. Um, and again, in my book, it mentions kennings and it mentions the different types of poetry and the way that it would be woven. So this lady is out practicing. She's practicing her craft in the forest in Denmark. And all of these are little critters that kind of showed up to listen to what she was saying, because it was like a song to their ears. It was a different tonation. It was something they had never heard before, much like music. Um, so you have the specific bird there at her. I again, I have so much information in my head, I forgot exactly. But in the book, it mentions the bird. It's not a rose finch, but it's something similar. And then the deer in the woods behind her, the European brown hare listening, the red fox. And the other animals there, the little cottonwood and the warthog also in there. Um, so you see her in her traditional dress, and you'd think, well, why is she all dressed up when she's out in the forest practicing her craft? Well, chances are this was right before she went to the lodge, and this was also considered a profession. They were paid to come and perform in front of the Jarl and the Queen and all of the dignitaries there at the gathering and everyone there at the time. So it was a really special event for the Skald to show up. And trust me, she had everyone's ear, because she usually had a very beautiful voice if it was a woman. Oftentimes it was a man, a male Skald also. But usually they sang in ways to convey this wording, and and it was a very interesting event, and another individual in early Norse society that you really don't hear much about. Yeah. And here we have um, another important part of ancient Norse society, and it was the uh, the food and the drink. This is the mead maker, and again, the text that goes along with this painting talks about the location. This was Jorvik, which is York, England today. You can see the countryside in the back. And yes, they were already farming. Those were communal farms and everything that was going on. And this man was the mead maker and also the beekeeper. So you have the lady in the background to the left bringing in her wooden bucket of berries, and then you see two gentlemen in the background. They are the very important mead testers. They're testing out the mead to make sure that it's actually a very good product. And of course, I think one fella maybe had a little bit too much, because he's seeing birds that aren't there. Uh, and then his companion is wondering what he's really talking about. But the big thing is the fjord horse is in the background, and he smells the mead, and that was something that really got his attention. So, uh, honey in particular is some of the oldest recipes that date back long before the Middle Ages. It dates all the way back to 200, 300 BC in Europe, and then in Egypt, even earlier than that. Um, Honey itself, if it is, it's an interesting item. It can last 3,000 years if it's sealed well in something and can be preserved for that long. It's one of the few things on Earth that can still be, uh, you know, palatable after 3,000 years. So you have the mead maker there. He's pouring out some mead, and his daughter is she's the budding artist. She's drawing little vignettes of the bees on the mead cart. Has the honey right there beside her, and uh, her little bear dog hanging out with her, and another Norwegian forest cat in the background there looking around the corner. And so he's getting ready to take off with his mead cart and deliver the mead. So when I built this frame in particular, I decided that, well, if it's the mead maker and there's honey in the equation, well, I'm just going to have to sculpt some bees in the corner. So in each corner, you'll see this little bee sculptures, and I used gold leaf to embellish the bees themselves and sculpted it with the polymer clay specifically to fit that. And you can't quite tell in this picture, but if you can go to the exhibition and see these frames, all of the copper leaf, gold leaf, it's very vivid. And it is something that takes quite a bit of time. And each strand, when I'm applying it, it's all by hand. It's all the old way, and gold lid copper leaf that's been done for hundreds of years. It's not sprayed on with a spray can. It's all done the old way. So it all kind of comes together in something that shows you an image of a society that is so misunderstood today. In the main culture, North society is so misunderstood. And so, that's what this book series is about. This, of course, Art and Crafts is the first in the series. And I'm getting close to coming out with 4 more to the next 2. But Lorraine may want to have some things that you go to before I start talking about the rest of the series.
Sure. We've just want to remind folks that the exhibition at Vesterheim is open through October 27th of this year. And here's just a little glimpse of the gallery, so you get a sense of what the paintings will look like when you come to see them. And it's wonderful to have you draw attention to some of these details, not only the frames in the corners, but also the painting themselves, things to look for when we come to see it. And we've got another special opportunity for folks, and that's that the day the exhibit closes, October 27th, you'll be back in Decorah, Sven, and doing an in-gallery, in-person talk for us. So if you're in the Decorah area, we hope you'll come back on October 27th to meet Sven and hear him talk in the gallery. This might be a good view too for you to comment on the table. We had heard just a little bit about that before, but here's the table you made.
Absolutely. Uh, this is a red oak Scandinavian style table that I designed and built and did the hand carving on, not only on the top and the corners, but also on the beam at the bottom. And these trestle tables usually were built in four sections so that they could be taken apart and traveled with. So you have the tabletop, then you have the leg panels, and then you have the beam holding it all together. Um, and I milled everything by hand, and red oak was a material that was used primarily for the keel of the old Viking ships because it was so very hard. And I'll tell you, it is very hard because when I was carving this stuff, it was like concrete. It's again, you have a great appreciation for the carvers working with all these different materials that they work with and what they turn out. And who gets to have a 1,000-year-old Viking sword displayed on the top of their table? You have to see this. It's incredible. It's been in your collection for almost 100 years.
Mhm.
Uh, correct? Prince Olav of Norway presented that in the 30s.
Exactly.
And quite
And
honestly,
well,
it's
Vesterheim
one of the
wouldn't normally
finest
have a
swords I've
Viking
ever.
sword, but this was a gift from a Norwegian museum to our collection.
Yes. And actually, in all my research and all my studies, for as old as what it is and where it was found, it's one of the most extraordinary versions I've ever seen. It's really amazing. So everyone, you have to try to come and see it. And on the opposite end is a replica of the yelling stone, the rune stone that you find in Denmark that Harald Bluetooth discovered. And what's interesting that I want to add really quickly is when I was carving the corners of this table, the motifs that I carved are very serpentine, but they have horse heads on them, which was a typical thing that you saw a lot of. It wasn't always the dragon heads. Well, so when the runestone was brought out, and I took a very close look, I realized that the animal on the runestone also has a very horse head uh, motif, and of course, I had never seen the stone before. Uh, so what's wonderful about it is I think it's of course meant to be that these items are together and being displayed in the show. And yeah, I think if any and all of you can make it to the exhibit, if you haven't been there yet, it's well worth the travel. And not just with my exhibit, but the rest of the museum. It's so extraordinary. There's so many wonderful things in your collection that is definitely worth traveling to.
And the book that Sven has been mentioning throughout today is his Art and Crafts of Ancient Scandinavia. And this is available at Vesterheim's museum store. You can come in person, visit the website, or give us a call to get a copy. And coming soon, you alluded to this, more books in the Ancient
Yes,
Norse art
yes.
book series. How exciting!
Yeah, that the next two are already written, and I am in the process of doing photo shoots, and I've already started the paintings. The next two are Love, Life, and Language in Ancient Scandinavia, which talks about daily relationship, things that happen throughout life in family dynamics, and also the written language, the spoken language. So there are a lot of really interesting scenarios that are part of that. And then the third book, again written, I'm working on the images for, is Sport and Agriculture in Ancient Scandinavia, which shows you the root of the what we consider sports today, skiing and all these other types of things that Norway dominates the Olympics with now as a sport, but it's simply because in the old days that's how you got around. So sport and then the agricultural part of it as to what folks at that time ate, what they grew, the communal farm systems. So there's a tremendous amount of material there that you don't see or hear about in the mainstream. And so these next two books are going to have the images with it. And so keep an eye out on what's happening. And we're also putting together and creating the Lindauer Fine Art channel on YouTube. So everyone stay posted and we've got a lot of great things with that coming up soon.
Oh, that's so exciting. Well, let's see. Our time has really flown by. It's hard to believe, but we've got time for just a couple questions. And so one of the questions goes back to the wood carver painting. And someone asked about the style of carving, if you could tell us how that was spelled.
Oh, there's two types of carving that start with a B, but this one is Broa, Broa. And then there was a later carving style called Boré, and that was Borre. So the Boré style was much later. That was before the yelling style, which is one of the last carving styles you'll see. It's still in Scandinavia today on some of the old buildings. But this was Broa, Broa.
Wonderful. And I think that's another great thing about your work is it really inspires us to want to dig in and learn some of these things, learn more that your paintings just give us a glimpse at. Well, we have time for one last question. And actually, it's more of a comment. It's someone thanking us or thanking you for setting so many of the artworks in different places. We saw paintings just today that were set in Norway and the Faroe Islands and England. And so this is a comment of appreciation for setting your paintings to help us understand better the geographic range of the Viking exploration and settlement.
I'm very welcome. I appreciate the thought. That's great. That's, you know, many years of work in this and all of that's part of it. So I appreciate that feedback. Thank you.